Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving into something that fascinates almost every single one of us: flying, soaring, and the expansion of human mobility. We're going to explore exactly why terrestrial primates like us, creatures who are fundamentally completely bound by gravity, are just so relentlessly obsessed with taking to the skies. To do this, we'll be tying together some incredible insights from infant development, ancient mythology, neuroscience, and modern engineering to answer a surprisingly deep question.
Think about it. There's a deep paradox right at the core of human nature. Our biological bodies are built entirely for the Earth, right? We walk, we crawl, we climb trees, and yet our minds effortlessly construct this vivid, exhilarating experience of flight. We dream about it constantly, we've written stories about it for millennia, and we spend literal billions of dollars engineering ways to actually do it. So why does a species that absolutely cannot fly biologically possess such a rich, internal blueprint for soaring?
Well, here's the massive gap we're dealing with. There's this huge divide between what our physical bodies can do and what our minds can conceive. While our biological action space is strictly limited to the dirt beneath our feet, our imagined action space is just vastly larger. The human brain can construct completely coherent, realistic experiences of actions that our physical biology has never, ever been capable of performing. And honestly, flight is probably the most dramatic universal example of this cognitive superpower.
Let's start breaking this down with part 1, myths, metaphors, and dreams.
This obsession definitely isn't a modern phenomenon, and it's not isolated to just one part of the world either. Take the classic Greek myth of Icarus, tragically falling after his wax wings melted from flying way too close to the sun. Now compare that to the Iranian king Kay Kāvus from the Shahnameh, who plummeted out of the sky in a throne lifted by exhausted eagles. These are two completely different cultures, yet they came up with the exact same narrative structure, this artificial, incredibly hubristic ascent that crosses a forbidden boundary, ultimately leading to a tragic fall. It really shows us that, historically, flying wasn't just about movement, it was about the regulation of human limits.
And this desire to break the boundaries of the Earth stretches back thousands of years. Look at the ancient Mesopotamian myth of King Etana ascending toward heaven on the back of an eagle. For our ancestors, the sky wasn't just empty physical space, it was a totally different ontological region. Vertical distance was literally equated with crossing into a divine or forbidden domain. Moving upward meant approaching the gods, seeking forbidden knowledge, or even attempting to transcend mortality itself.
We actually still encode this vertical geometry into our everyday emotional language. Just think about the metaphors we use all the time. When things are going great, you're flying high, you feel uplifted, or you're on top of the world. Upward movement equals energy, agency, and success. But what about when things go wrong? You're feeling low, you crash, or you're brought down. It turns out our brains have mapped the actual geometry of flight and falling directly onto our emotional regulatory systems.
Which brings us to a wildly universal human experience: the flying dream. In our dreams, we just bypass physical constraints entirely. When you fly in a dream, your brain isn't sitting there calculating lift, thrust, wing loading, or aerodynamics. A simulated intention simply combines with internally generated movement, and your brain effortlessly concludes, "Oh hey, I am flying." It's undeniable proof that our brains can spontaneously generate the pure feeling of soaring without knowing a single thing about real-world aviation physics. So, with all this incredible biological and cultural evidence, it naturally leads us to ask a really specific question. Did humans evolve a secret, dedicated biological instinct just for flying? Like, is there a specific cluster of neurons just sitting in our heads waiting to be unlocked? The answer is a massive, emphatic no. Current neuroscience gives us absolutely zero reason to believe there's a hidden flight center in our neurology. So, if we don't have a biological flying circuit, how on earth do our brains know how to construct the feeling of flight so perfectly?
Well, instead of relying on a single circuit, the brain brilliantly recombines older basic systems. You already know what acceleration feels like, thanks to your vestibular system. You know what height looks like visually. You know exactly what a lack of support feels like from, say, jumping or falling. Your cerebellum predicts movement, and your hippocampus constructs spatial scenes. Basically, your brain acts like a master DJ, taking all these everyday terrestrial tracks and mixing them together to construct the entirely novel, magical experience of flight.
Let's dig a little deeper into why we do this in part 2, expanding our action space. Picture a baby just learning to crawl. Now, they aren't crawling because they secretly wish they had wings, right? They are discovering what psychologists call affordances. They're learning exactly how their tiny body can interact with the world around them. A floor suddenly becomes something they can cross. A table becomes something they can reach. Human development is all about progressively enlarging our perceived, remembered, and simulated action space.
And this builds into a really beautiful functional hierarchy. It starts with basic sensation. Then, as we interact with the world, that levels up into perception. We remember those interactions, which eventually allows our brains to predict and simulate things before we actually do them. And finally, we reach imagination. We can recombine past experiences to simulate movements we have never actually performed. Imagination is what allows us to evaluate a trajectory that isn't physically happening yet.
Now, there is a crucial distinction in our imagination here. Both soaring and falling involved unsupported vertical movement through space. So why does soaring feel incredible while falling feels absolutely terrifying? The secret ingredient is agency. When you have high agency and high perceived control over your self-motion, you are soaring. Take that control away, and you are just falling. Agency is the key variable that transforms vertical motion into joyous flight.
So the mind's math for flight is actually super elegant. It takes our everyday terrestrial experiences of vertical movement, like jumping or climbing, adds the forward motion of running, factors in our deep sense of self-agency, and simply subtracts the physical constraint of the ground, and boom, just like that, we have imagined soaring. It is an absolute conceptual masterpiece of the human brain, achieved entirely without wings.
All right, let's bring this all into the real world with Part 3, Engineering the Dream.
There's a massive fundamental shift when we transition from ancient myths to actual engineering. While myths narratively just erase physical constraints, like say a magic carpet that completely ignores gravity, engineers actually have to reconstruct our dreams within the strict boundaries of physical laws. They have to translate our limitless imagined action space into a technologically achievable action space. Imagination reduces constraints, but engineering literally has to compensate for them.
To actually get off the ground in the real world, we had to recognize and solve the absolute physical constraints of gravity, lift, drag, thrust, stability, and control. When the Wright brothers finally succeeded, they essentially turned the airplane into an externalized mobility organ. We didn't evolve biological wings. Instead, our collective human culture and cognition built an external system to radically expand our body's physical action space. And just look at how fast this outward push accelerates over time. We started with our strict biological limits on the surface of the Earth. Then we expanded into the atmosphere with engineered aerial mobility. After that, we pushed right into orbital space, and now we're looking at interplanetary space. Every single step is humanity pushing our achievable action space entirely beyond what our biology ever intended.
So, if there is one big takeaway from this entire explainer, it's this. Our human obsession with flight isn't actually about birds, and it's definitely not some random biological glitch. It is simply the ultimate, most extreme expression of our brain's innate drive to continuously expand what we can do and where we can go. Flight just happens to be the most powerful version of this because it removes the absolute oldest constraint on terrestrial life, the need for a floor.
I'm going to leave you with this thought to chew on. If a massive, incredibly complex machine like an airplane is fundamentally just the physical manifestation of a crawling infant's instinct to reach a little further into the world, as our collective imagination continues to wildly outpace our biological bodies, what invisible boundaries will our drive for mobility expansion cross next? Thanks so much for learning with me today.